Hello, friends. Today is the 4th of November, 2025. I've just come across a video about the situation in Venezuela by Professor John Mearsheimer. And I'm going to just run it for you. It's about 20 minutes. I hope I'm not infringing the copyrights of the channel. I will put the link to the channel in the description. But I think I will just let him speak. I have been following the Venezuela crisis, and I have been listening to channels in Latin America and Venezuela, Argentina, about what is happening there. But I was getting rather fatigued about all the wars, and I'm not the right person to comment on what is happening. I have my opinions, of course. But I thought that this is so powerful in the way he explains what is happening that you should hear it. The background to Venezuela was, oh my goodness, if we go back to 2020, that is when I started paying attention to the situation there. I know that their assets are frozen, I believe, here in London. The same thing that happened to the Russian assets. And I remember listening to someone speaking, a politician there, saying that even though their assets were frozen, at that moment of the illness, the panic, and being able to buy things and masks and all the rest of it, that they had asked London to pay with that money, the frozen assets, to pay for those needs. And at the time, what I heard from them is that London refused. Since then, I have been following it. I haven't reported on it, but anyway. At first, I thought, shall I summarize what he says? But he speaks with such emphasis. He is of the realist school in international relations, the leader of the realist school. And I think that you might want to hear it. So let me just bring it up here.
Extraordinary unfold in the Caribbean, something that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. Russian warships have arrived in Venezuelan waters, not for a ceremonial port visit, but as a calculated act of geopolitical signaling. This is not simply about naval maneuvers or the projection of maritime power. It is a direct challenge to 2 centuries of American dominance in the Western Hemisphere, a challenge to the very premise of the Monroe Doctrine itself. Since 1823, Washington has regarded the Americas as its exclusive sphere of influence. That assumption that the Western Hemisphere belongs to the United States is now being openly contested. Moscow's naval presence in Venezuela is more than a show of force, it's a response. It is Russia's answer to decades of NATO expansion eastward, to missile defense systems built along its borders, and to what the Kremlin views as a relentless campaign of Western encirclement. For Venezuela, the stakes could not be higher. Sitting atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, the country has become the flashpoint for a much broader contest, one that will determine who sets the rules of global order in the 21st stone century. Washington's playbook of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and threats of intervention has failed to produce the regime change it sought. Instead, it has driven Caracas deeper into strategic partnerships with Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. This moment is not about a few Russian ships anchored off the Venezuelan coast. It's about the unraveling of an entire world order. The slow erosion of unipolarity and the rise of a multipolar system where American power is no longer uncontested. To understand how we reach this point, we must trace the roots of this crisis because nothing in geopolitics happens in isolation. The Russian fleet in the Caribbean is not an isolated event. It is the culmination of decades of American policy, a policy that has alienated partners, emboldened adversaries, and pushed the world toward a new and uncertain balance of power. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the United States stood at the height of its global influence. It was the sole superpower, victorious in the Cold War, unchallenged militarily, economically, and ideologically. Many in Washington believed that history itself had ended, that liberal democracy and market capitalism had triumphed once and for all. The question then was simple. What would America do with its unprecedented dominance? In the euphoria of the early 1990s, American policymakers faced a historic opportunity. The Soviet Union was gone. Russia, newly independent and struggling to define its identity, was reaching out to the West. The world was ready for a new security framework, one built not on confrontation, but on cooperation. We could have chosen to integrate Russia into a shared European architecture to craft institutions that reflected the realities of a post-Cold War world, but we didn't. Instead, we chose dominance. Rather than extending a genuine hand of partnership, we expanded the very military alliance that had been created to contain the Soviet Union. NATO, once confined to Western Europe, began its march eastward, first to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, then to the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Each new wave of expansion was sold to the public as an extension of democracy and security, but to Moscow, it was a slow-moving encirclement. There were warnings, serious, informed, and prophetic voices urged restraint. George Kennan, the architect of America's Cold War containment strategy, called NATO expansion the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. He understood something Washington refused to accept, that Russia, regardless of who led it, would view the arrival of NATO troops on its borders as an existential threat. The pivotal moment came in 2008 at the NATO SU, MIT in Bucharest. There, the alliance announced its intention for Ukraine and Georgia to eventually become members. For Russia, that was a red line crossed. Ukraine is not just another neighboring state. It is the historical and cultural heart of Russian civilization. The first Russian state was born in Kiev. The notion of NATO missile systems positioned just a few hundred miles from Moscow was intolerable to any Russian government, liberal or nationalist alike. But Washington pressed on, convinced that Russia was too weak to respond, too dependent on Western institutions, too constrained by its internal chaos. We believed that history itself was on our side, that our model of global leadership was inevitable and irreversible. It was a fatal miscalculation. What happened next in Europe would soon echo in the Americas. The same mindset that drove NATO expansion eastward, the belief that U.S. dominance must be preserved at all costs, began to shape our policies closer to home. The logic was identical: secure influence, prevent alternatives, and punish defiance. And just as we alienated Russia through coercion and exclusion, we applied the same approach to Latin America, especially Venezuela. To understand what's unfolding in the Caribbean today, we have to revisit Venezuela's modern political journey because it mirrors in many ways America's broader pattern of dominance and reaction. When Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999, he did so through democratic elections. His message was simple yet radical, that Venezuela's vast oil wealth should serve the poor majority rather than the entrenched elite and foreign corporations that had long profited from it. Whatever one thinks of Chavez's rhetoric or governance, he represented something profound, a challenge to Washington's economic order in its own hemisphere. From the moment he began redirecting oil revenues into social programs, building alliances with Cuba, and promoting a vision of Latin American independence, he became a target. Washington saw him not as a democratically elected leader with a populist mandate, but as a threat to its influence, a potential contagion that might inspire others to defy U.S. power. In 2002, a coup attempt against Chavez briefly removed him from office. It was backed by sectors of Venezuela's elite and, as later documents revealed, had tacit support from the United States. The coup failed, but it marked a turning point. From that moment on, the relationship between Washington and Caracas descended into open hostility. When Nicolas Maduro succeeded Chavez after his death in 2013, the pressure intensified. The United States imposed wave after wave of sanctions, not the narrow, targeted kind aimed at specific officials, but sweeping measures that crippled the entire economy. Venezuela was cut off from international financial markets. Oil exports, the lifeblood of its economy, were blocked. Billions in state assets were frozen abroad. And at Borredi, the results were catastrophic. The country's economy shrank by more than 75%. Inflation soared to levels unimaginable. Hospitals ran out of basic medicines. Food shortages became widespread. The once thriving oil industry collapsed. American officials justified this as a fight for democracy. But the reality was much darker. The sanctions were designed not to promote reform, but to create desperation, to make the economy scream, as former National Security Advisor John Bolton bluntly put it. Tens of thousands of Venezuelans died as a direct result of the economic collapse. Millions fled the country, triggering one of the largest refugee crises in Latin American history. And yet, despite all this suffering, the Maduro government did not fall. The policy failed, but instead of prompting a rethink, it hardened Washington's resolve. In practice, the sanctions achieved the opposite of their intended goal. They drove Venezuela deeper into the arms of Russia, China, and Iran, nations Steve had understood what it meant to be on the receiving end of American pressure and saw in Caracas a strategic opportunity. Venezuela's story, then, is not just about socialism or authoritarianism. It's about what happens when a powerful nation refuses to tolerate political or economic independence within its sphere of influence. As Washington tightened the noose around Venezuela, Moscow saw an opening, a chance to reassert itself on the global stage and challenge U.S. dominance not in Eastern Europe, but in America's own backyard. The logic was both strategic and symbolic. If NATO could expand to Russia's borders, then Russia could extend its influence into the Western Hemisphere and be our Russian-Venezuelan relations deepened rapidly. What began as oil cooperation soon evolved into a full-fledged strategic partnership. Russian energy firms invested billions in Venezuela's state oil company. Technical advisors and engineers began arriving quietly, followed by military specialists. Moscow supplied Caracas with fighter jets, air defense systems, and armored vehicles. Then came the naval deployments. Since 2008, Russian warships have periodically visited Venezuelan ports. Gestures of solidarity at first, but now unmistakably political. These aren't ceremonial visits, they're declarations. Each arrival of a Russian vessel in the Caribbean sends a message to Washington. If you can deploy forces on our borders, we can do the same in yours. The symbolism is unmistakable. It's Moscow's way of saying that the post-Cold War era of U.S. impunity is over. For every missile system placed in Eastern Europe, there can be a Russian frigate off the coast of South America. For every alliance built in Russia's neighborhood, there can be a counter-alliance in America's. For Venezuela, Russia's presence offers more than military reassurance. It provides a lifeline. Under siege from sanctions and economic isolation, Caracas turned to Moscow for not just weapons, but also financing, support, technical expertise, and international legitimacy. Russian oil companies helped sustain limited production. Russian advisors trained Venezuelan personnel and fortified key installations. The partnership became one of necessity, not ideology. In this sense, Venezuela has become a mirror image of the Cold War dynamic, only this time it's the United States facing a rival presence in its own hemisphere. The same logic of containment that once defined American policy toward the Soviet Union has now been inverted. Yet the danger here is not simply military. Structural. What's taking shape is a new geography of resistance, a network of nations that share one thing in common. They've all been targeted, sanctioned, or isolated by Washington. Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela. Different systems, different ideologies, but united by a shared experience of Western coercion. Their cooperation is born not out of shared vision, but out of necessity, out of survival. And every time the U.S. adds another country to its list of sanctioned states, that network grows stronger. So when Russian destroyers anchor off Venezuela's coast, they're not just projecting power. They're signaling that the world has changed, that even in the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. can no longer act without consequence. What makes the current situation so perilous is that it was never inevitable. None of this, the Russian warships, the Venezuelan collapse, the deepening global divide, had to happen. It is the cumulative result of choices of a foreign policy built on dominance rather than diplomacy. For decades, the United States has approached the world as a chessboard, believing that control equals security and that influence must be enforced rather than earned. But each move toward dominance has produced unintended consequences, alienating potential partners and driving them into the arms of our adversaries. The humanitarian toll of this approach is staggering. In Venezuela, sanctions were sold as a tool to promote democracy. In reality, they punished an entire nation. The collapse of Venezuela's economy was not a natural disaster, it was engineered. The nation, once among the richest in Latin America, saw its GDP shrink by more than 3/4. Hospitals lost electricity and medicine, families went hungry, children died of treatable diseases. And officials in Washington described this suffering as necessary pressure, the price of freedom. John Bolton, serving as National Security Advisor, openly admitted that the goal was to make the Venezuelan economy scream. The phrase was chilling not just for its callousness, but for its honesty. It revealed what these policies truly are, acts of economic warfare designed to break a society's will. And Venezuela is not an isolated case. The pattern repeats across the globe. In Iraq, sanctions throughout the 1990s led to hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. In Libya, a US-backed intervention turned a functioning state into a failed one, now home to open slave markets. In Syria, the pursuit of regime change prolonged a civil war that killed 500,000 people. In Afghanistan, 20 years of occupation ended with the same Taliban government we tried to eliminate after trillions of dollars and countless lives lost each time. The justification was the same: democracy, human rights, humanitarian intervention, and each time the outcome was chaos, suffering, and instability. The United States has yet to confront the moral and strategic bankruptcy of this pattern. Our leaders continue to tell us that these actions make the world safer and freer, but the evidence points the other way. Each intervention, each sanction regime, each covert operation erodes our credibility, undermines international law, and fuels resentment across entire regions. The world no longer sees America as the defender of democracy. Increasingly, it sees an empire in denial, one that lectures others about freedom while wielding power without restraint. That is the real cost of dominance. Not only the suffering it inflicts abroad, but the corrosion it causes within. The moral blindness, the loss of perspective, the refusal to recognize limits. A nation that cannot acknowledge the damage it causes cannot lead effectively, and it certainly cannot claim the moral authority to define global order. If there is one thing that defines the current crisis, it is hypocrisy, the glaring double standard in how the United States sees its actions versus how it interprets the actions of others. We maintain nearly 800 military bases in more than 70 countries. Our naval fleets patrol every ocean. Our aircraft fly missions over regions thousands of miles from our own borders. We spend more on defense than the next 10 nations combined. And for more than 2 decades, we have been almost constantly at war. We justify this as global leadership, as the maintenance of a rules-based international order. But when another power, Russia, China, Iran, projects influence beyond its borders, we call it aggression. When we build alliances, it's collective security. When others do it, it's expansionism. When we deploy troops abroad, it's stability. When others do it, it's provocation. This selective morality has not gone unnoticed. To much of the world, America's rules-based order looks less like a system of fairness and more like a hierarchy, one where the rules apply to everyone but the United States. We invoke sovereignty when it suits us and violate it when it doesn't. We condemn election interference abroad while funding opposition movements ourselves. We denounce state repression in rival nations while arming and financing authoritarian regimes that serve our interests. From Latin America to the Middle East, people remember. They remember the coups we backed in Guatemala, Chile, and Argentina. They remember the death squads trained in U.S. programs. They remember how we supported dictatorships as long as they were anti-communist, and how we undermined democratically elected governments if they dared to challenge U.S. economic or political control. So when Washington says it cares about democracy in Venezuela, few believe it. The rest of the world has learned that America's concern for democracy is conditional, a language of convenience used when it aligns with our interests and discarded when it doesn't. This hypocrisy has consequences. It fuels resentment, distrust, and defiance. Nations that might otherwise cooperate with us increasingly turn elsewhere, not because they love Moscow or Beijing, but because they no longer trust Washington. Our moral authority, once our greatest strength, has been squandered. And this loss of credibility comes at a moment when the global balance of power is shifting. The unipolar moment that followed the Cold War is over. We are entering a multipolar era, a world with multiple centers of power, where the U.S. can no longer dictate outcomes unilaterally. Yet our foreign policy establishment refuses to adapt. Instead of accepting this new reality and engaging it through diplomacy, we cling to the illusions of dominance, responding to every challenge with sanctions, threats, or force. This is how empires decline, not through invasion or collapse, but through arrogance, through the inability to see that the world has changed while they have not. The arrival of Russian ships in Venezuelan waters is not merely a symbolic act of defiance. It's a warning, a mirror held up to American foreign policy, reflecting back the consequences of decades of coercion, intervention, and moral blindness. It tells us in unmistakable terms that the old order is collapsing. The question is whether the United States is willing to face that truth. For too long, we have mistaken dominance for leadership. We have equated power with legitimacy and coercion with influence. We have acted as though the only way to preserve stability is to control it. And in doing so, we've created the very instability we claim to prevent. Venezuela is the clearest example of this failure. Instead of engaging Caracas through dialogue, we tried to isolate it. Instead of offering economic cooperation, we imposed sanctions that devastated ordinary people. Instead of respecting Venezuelan sovereignty, we supported efforts to overthrow its government. And now we find ourselves confronted by Russian warships a few hundred miles from our shores, an outcome entirely of our own making. The same logic has played out elsewhere. In Europe, NATO expansion pushed Russia into confrontation. In Asia, military containment of China has accelerated the very rivalry we hope to avoid. In the Middle East, interventionism has turned entire regions into war zones. Every attempt to maintain control through force has only hastened the decline of American influence. There was always another path, one rooted in humility rather than hubris. We could have built partnerships instead of dependencies. We could have used our immense power to strengthen international institutions, not circumvent them. We could have led by example, showing that democracy and prosperity flourish through cooperation, not coercion. Imagine a different relationship with Venezuela, a nation rich in oil and resources, working with the United States to meet regional energy needs, to stabilize markets, to build prosperity. That was always possible. Instead, we chose to suffocate their economy, ensuring that any recovery would depend on alliances with our rivals. Imagine a different relationship with Russia, integrated into a shared European security framework rather than isolated and antagonized. Or with China, a competitor, yes, but also a partner in solving global challenges like climate change, pandemics, and economic inequality. The tragedy is not that these options were unavailable. It's that we refuse to take, because taking them would have required something Washington has long lacked: humility. The great powers that endure are those that learn to adapt, to evolve with changing realities. Those that fail to adapt collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. The United States stands at that crossroads now. The Russian warships off the coast of Venezuela are more than a headline. They are a moment of reckoning. They signal that the post-Cold War illusion of uncontested American dominance has come to an end. The rest of the world is no longer willing to live under a system where Washington alone writes the rules. The age of unipolarity is fading, and a multipolar world is emerging, one that will demand a new kind of leadership. We can meet this moment with fear and confrontation, or with realism and renewal. We can continue doubling down on the failed strategies of coercion and control, or we can rediscover the art of diplomacy. The choice will define not only America's role in the 21st century, but the stability of the world itself. If we continue to pursue regime change operations, broad sanctions, and endless wars, we will only accelerate our decline. We will push more nations into alliances of resistance, into the very networks we claim to fear. We will find ourselves surrounded by crises of our own making, unable to lead, unable even to persuade. But there is another path. It begins with humility, with acknowledging that other nations have legitimate interests and that American power, no matter how vast, has limits. It means recognizing that democracy cannot be imposed by bombs or starvation, that freedom cannot grow under the shadow of sanctions. It means returning to diplomacy as the first tool of statecraft, not the last. We must lift the crushing sanctions on Venezuela and allow its people to rebuild their economy and their dignity. We must engage with Caracas directly, seeking gradual political reform through negotiation rather than coercion. We must accept that Venezuela's future belongs to Venezuelans, not to Washington, Moscow, or Beijing. And beyond Venezuela, we must redefine what leadership means in a multipolar world. It means engaging adversaries with respect, not hostility. It means building coalitions based on mutual interest, not dominance. It means leading through example by strengthening our democracy at home, by rebuilding our infrastructure, by addressing inequality and injustice within our own borders. Because a nation that cannot govern itself wisely cannot hope to guide others. If we do not change course, the pattern will continue: confrontation, resistance, escalation. The world will become more fragmented, more dangerous, and less free. But if we choose diplomacy over dominance, cooperation over coercion, humility over hubris, we might yet build a more stable and just global order, one where power is balanced by responsibility and where influence is earned, not imposed. The Russian ships in Venezuelan waters are not just a challenge, they are a message. They are telling us that the world is shifting, that the age of unilateral control is over. The question is whether the United States will learn from this moment or repeat its mistakes, because the truth is simple. The world is not ours to control. It never was. It belongs to all who inhabit it, and it will only endure if we learn to share it. That is the lesson of Venezuelan waters, if we are willing to hear it.
Okay, so I think I'll leave it there. I have nothing to add, really. Let me know in the comments whether you agree or whether you disagree, want to add something. But this is a serious moment, isn't it? So, although I heard Scott Ritter saying that he wasn't talking about the naval ships, but he was talking about other planes arriving in Venezuela with armaments and so on. And he thought that that was, they couldn't do anything with that. So I don't know, he disagreed. But perhaps with this arrival now, I don't know. But I hope this was useful to you. Thank you. Bye-bye.